In the heart of Washington, D.C., the marble halls of the Capitol hummed with anticipation. A critical Senate Judiciary Committee hearing was about to begin, one that promised to be nothing short of explosive. At the center of it sat Senator John Neely Kennedy, the seasoned Republican from Louisiana, known for his biting humor, plain-spoken manner, and the kind of Southern drawl that disarmed as often as it unsettled. But today, the charm was being put to the test. Kennedy had weathered political storms before, but this one was different. The hearing was stacked against him, an orchestrated effort by a faction of rising progressives to paint him as antiquated, tone-deaf, and even dangerous in his positions. The atmosphere was electric with tension, cameras rolling, not a seat left unfilled. As the gavel struck and the hearing commenced, the storm clouds gathered fast. Before we dive into this gripping moment where everything turned on a single clip, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you enjoy stories that reveal the unseen strategies behind the most dramatic moments in American politics, you're in the right place. As the proceedings began, Kennedy sat calm, flipping through a thick folder of notes. His opponents weren't holding back. From the opening statements, it was clear. This wasn't just about policy anymore, it was personal. The lead inquisitor was Senator Alana Ruiz, a young, sharp progressive with a reputation for turning hearings into spectacles. She came armed with graphs, quotes, and a fervent determination to corner Kennedy on his voting record, past statements, and perceived inconsistencies. The attacks were relentless. Ruiz cited outdated remarks, isolated votes, and cherry-picked interviews to craft a narrative of hypocrisy. "Senator Kennedy," she said, her voice steady, "you have repeatedly positioned yourself as a defender of the Constitution, yet your record on civil liberties, minority rights, and governmental overreach tells a much darker story." The room held its breath. The senator offered only a faint smile. To most in the room, and certainly to millions watching the live stream, it looked like Kennedy was boxed in. Ruiz's momentum was building. She cross-referenced his past with modern values, contrasting his folksy soundbites with hard data that made them seem out of touch. Even among his allies, concern flickered. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He listened, jotted occasional notes, and made no attempt to interrupt. It was as if he was waiting. Across the room, a few skeptical faces began to shift uneasily. Senator Marlowe, an old-school Democrat with a fondness for civility, furrowed his brow. Something didn't feel right. Kennedy's silence wasn't defeat. It was something else. Behind closed doors, Kennedy's advisors exchanged worried glances. His chief of staff, a wiry man named Cooper, leaned in and whispered, "Sir, do you want to respond now?" Kennedy didn't look up. "Let her finish," he murmured. The hearing dragged on, each question sharper than the last, each accusation designed to undermine Kennedy's integrity. The headlines were already being drafted in newsrooms across the country. Ruiz was trending on social media. The narrative was forming. Kennedy was losing. But inside that quiet, composed exterior, John Neely Kennedy wasn't rattled. He was preparing. What no one knew, not even his own team, was that he had a trump card. A single piece of evidence that, when released, wouldn't just shift the balance of the hearing. It would silence the room, and he would reveal it only when the time was right. The committee recessed briefly for lunch, but the conversation didn't stop. In corridors, cafeterias, and media studios nearby, the verdict had already been cast. Kennedy was on the ropes. Senator Ruiz had landed her blows, and the buzz surrounding her performance was growing louder by the minute. Cable news anchors dissected each exchange, praising her preparation, declaring the day a clear victory for her side. Back in his office, Kennedy's team moved quickly. They reviewed transcripts, highlighted inaccuracies, and debated which point to counter first. Emotions ran high. Some pushed for a direct rebuttal immediately upon the hearing's return. Others warned against reacting emotionally. But Kennedy sat unmoved. He poured a glass of water, leaned back, and studied the ceiling for a long moment. Cooper, his chief of staff, finally broke the silence. "Senator, we can't let this sit. Her words are hitting like truth. We need to push back now." Kennedy looked at him with the same calm that had unnerved so many over the years. That's the problem, Coop. They're hitting like truth, but they're not. Let her play her hand. His advisors didn't know he already had something Ruiz and her team hadn't accounted for. A piece of video buried in public archives, largely ignored, dismissed by many but deeply relevant. He had reviewed it personally the night before, replayed it half a dozen times. It wasn't just proof, it was perspective. And in this game, timing mattered more than noise. Meanwhile, across the capital, Ruiz held court in a private lounge. Surrounded by aides, legal analysts, and political strategists, she basked in the praise. "We've got him. He can't spin out of this. Let's be ready for the next wave," she said confidently. Her campaign manager grinned. "This goes viral before he can breathe." Ruiz's confidence wasn't arrogance. She had spent weeks preparing, poring over Kennedy's public record, dissecting his most controversial moments. Her team had built a timeline that painted him as inconsistent, reactive, and misaligned with modern American values. What they didn't expect was resistance, not silence. In the hallway, journalists lined up outside the hearing chamber, microphones in hand, waiting for the next act. Speculation buzzed through every wire. Would Kennedy finally respond? Or had Senator Ruiz successfully dismantled a political veteran live in real time? Kennedy returned to the chamber first. He took his seat slowly, a small folder under his arm. He didn't speak. He didn't look shaken. Ruiz arrived minutes later, her posture firm, her expression confident. Behind her, murmurs of admiration echoed as senators retook their places. The gavel dropped. The session resumed. Chairman Doyle, presiding with practiced neutrality, looked around the chamber. "We now return to questioning. Senator Kennedy, if you wish to respond to any of the points raised earlier, you may proceed." Kennedy nodded. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Chairman." His voice was low, measured. "There's a lot to unpack, but I'd like to begin by thanking my colleague Senator Ruiz for her thorough engagement. It's clear she's committed to the issues. That deserves recognition." Some heads turned. That wasn't the tone they'd expected. "But before I respond fully," Kennedy continued, tapping the folder gently, "I believe some context is important, and I intend to provide it shortly." He leaned back, just enough. Not quite ready to strike, but no longer playing defense. The room was shifting again. Ruiz adjusted her microphone. Kennedy gave nothing away, because he knew the right moment was coming, and when it did, it would speak louder than anything he could say now. The air inside the chamber had changed. There was a stillness now, a cautious curiosity replacing the earlier fervor. Senator Kennedy, once the target, now seemed to hold the room in quiet anticipation. Chairman Doyle gave a subtle nod. The floor was his. Kennedy stood slowly, with the ease of a man who had walked this terrain before. His voice remained calm, unmistakably Southern, each word deliberate. "I've listened closely to the concerns raised. I understand the weight of the accusations, and I take them seriously," he began, his eyes sweeping across the room. "We live in a time when narrative often races ahead of truth. I've never minded being questioned. What I do mind is when questions are crafted not to seek answers, but to score points." The silence deepened. Even Senator Ruiz sat upright, attentive. No interruptions, no whispered objections. Kennedy continued, "Now, I don't believe in responding to spin with spin. I believe in clarity. So rather than argue point by point, I'd like to let something speak for itself." He opened the folder and removed a single document. "This is a verified recording, publicly available but perhaps overlooked. It's unedited, time-stamped, and quite relevant to this discussion." He handed it to a staffer. "Please play the clip." The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the video began. The voice was unmistakable. Senator Alana Ruiz, younger, during a public town hall 5 years earlier. She spoke passionately about constitutional protections, including a defense of speech, religious liberty, and skepticism toward federal surveillance powers. It wasn't the content that shocked the room. It was the contrast. In the clip, Ruiz argued fervently for positions nearly identical to the ones she had just condemned Kennedy for holding. The audience in the chamber froze. Her own words stood in stark contradiction to her attacks, and the conviction in her voice on that video was undeniable. When the clip ended, no one spoke. The silence wasn't just awkward, it was seismic. Kennedy didn't gloat, he didn't smirk. He simply nodded and returned to the microphone. We all evolve, I know that. But what troubles me is not that Senator Ruiz once said these things. It's that she pretended she hadn't, that she would paint others as relics while burying her own record. That's not discourse. That's strategy masked as righteousness. For a moment, Ruiz didn't move. Her jaw tightened. She glanced toward her aides, but no one met her eyes. Kennedy pressed on. This hearing wasn't supposed to be a trial. It was supposed to be a dialogue. If we've reached a point where disagreement equals moral failure, then we've lost the very principles we claim to defend. There was no applause, no reactions, just the weight of recognition sinking in. Kennedy looked toward the chairman. I yield the rest of my time. He sat, not a word more. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, unsure of what angle could possibly capture what had just shifted in that room. Senator Ruiz finally leaned into her mic. Her voice was steadier than expected, but the edge had dulled. Mr. Chairman, I request a brief recess. It was granted without objection. As the senators filed out, no one dared to speak above a whisper. Behind closed doors, phones lit up. Newsrooms scrambled. The clip was already making its rounds, and John Neely Kennedy sat still, eyes forward, knowing that what needed to be said had been said, not by him, but by the voice of contradiction that had spoken louder than any argument ever could. The clip spread faster than even Kennedy's team anticipated. Within minutes, it was trending across social media platforms. News outlets cut into scheduled programming to replay it. Headlines shifted. What had begun as a public reckoning for Kennedy had transformed into a sudden reckoning for Ruiz. Back in her office, Ruiz paced silently, her staff scattered around the room, their eyes glued to phones and monitors. No one spoke. The video wasn't just going viral, it was reshaping the narrative she had carefully constructed. She paused near the window, her expression unreadable. "Get me the transcript," she said at last, voice low. "I want every word I said in that town hall." Her press secretary hesitated. "Senator, the video is clear." "People aren't questioning its authenticity." "I'm not trying to fight the tape," Ruiz replied sharply. "I need to know how I let that go unnoticed." Meanwhile, across Capitol Hill, Kennedy's office was calm. No cheers, no boasting. Just a quiet, focused atmosphere. Cooper reviewed headlines with a detached expression. "They're spinning it as a political masterstroke," he muttered. Kennedy shook his head. "This wasn't about strategy, it was about fairness." Cooper looked up. "You didn't just shift public opinion, you exposed something deeper." Kennedy nodded, but his tone remained grounded. "People are tired of double standards. They want accountability, even from those who claim moral high ground." In the Senate lounge, murmurs of admiration began to surface. Senior legislators, who had kept quiet through much of the earlier exchanges, now spoke up. One veteran senator leaned toward a colleague and whispered, "He didn't just defend himself. He reminded us how this chamber used to operate." Even among the media, commentary took a new tone. Analysts who had just hours earlier questioned Kennedy's relevance were now reconsidering. One commentator noted, "He played the long game and it worked." But not everyone welcomed the shift. Progressive groups loyal to Ruiz scrambled to contain the damage. Some questioned the relevance of the clip, others tried to reframe it as a reflection of growth. But none of it stuck. The contrast was too fresh, the timing too sharp. In public forums, calls for Ruiz to explain the contradiction grew louder. A hashtag with her name and the word hypocrisy began trending. Requests for comment flooded her office. She finally addressed the press late that afternoon, her tone sober. "I stand by my current positions," she said, "but I acknowledge there was a time when my views aligned differently. I regret not addressing that evolution more transparently." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to one since the hearing began. Kennedy, for his part, remained measured. He declined major interviews, issued no victory statements, and avoided the media whirlwind. In a brief hallway comment, he said only, "This was never about winning a moment. It was about reminding people that truth still matters." His words were replayed repeatedly. Commentators noted the restraint, the contrast between noise and clarity. By evening, the hearing had become a national symbol of how a quiet, deliberate defense could carry more weight than hours of performance. Students debated it in law schools. Podcasts dissected it. Editorials shifted focus from Kennedy's record to the importance of intellectual honesty. He hadn't silenced Ruiz with volume. He had done it with timing, memory, and one undeniable fact. And in doing so, he didn't just salvage his name. He reminded the country of something they rarely saw in politics anymore: precision without pettiness, rebuttal without revenge. In the days following the hearing, the tremors didn't fade. They spread. What had unfolded in that Senate chamber became a moment of reflection far beyond Washington. News outlets replayed Kennedy's response alongside Ruiz's earlier accusations, inviting viewers to draw their own conclusions. And draw them they did. Polls shifted. Public sentiment, once leaning sharply against Kennedy, now showed a resurgence of respect, even among moderates and independents. The clip, short and unassuming, had cut through layers of narrative, noise, and posturing. It had reminded people that in the age of constant spin, authenticity still held power. But for Kennedy, it wasn't about polls. Back home in Louisiana, he returned to his daily rhythm. No celebration, no tour of victory. He visited local town halls, listened to constituents, and answered questions with the same blend of wit and sincerity that had defined his career. Yet those who saw him noticed something quieter beneath his usual composure, a sharpened awareness of the times they were living in. Sitting alone on his porch one evening, Kennedy watched the sun dip below the cypress trees. Cooper joined him carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You never told me about the clip," Cooper said. Kennedy smiled faintly. "Didn't need to." Cooper studied him. "You knew it would flip the hearing." "I knew it would reveal something," Kennedy replied. "Not just about her. About all of us." For Ruiz, the aftermath was more complicated. Her credibility hadn't vanished, but it had been bruised. In interviews, she spoke of growth, of the need for politicians to evolve. Some accepted it. Others weren't ready to forget the abruptness of her contradiction. What lingered wasn't her original stance. It was the omission of it, the attempt to rewrite it in real time. Kennedy made no public remarks about her again, but in a short op-ed published quietly a week later, he wrote, "Our nation is held together not by the absence of disagreement, but by the honesty with which we approach it. The American people can handle change. What they won't tolerate is deception cloaked in conviction." That line was quoted, reposted, and framed across offices and classrooms. It became a standard for a broader truth, transcending the individuals involved. In private circles, political strategists dissected the moment as a masterclass in restraint. "He didn't fight fire with fire," one analyst noted. "He let the silence speak. And when it did, it echoed louder than any speech." But perhaps the most unexpected outcome was what followed weeks later. A bipartisan proposal, drafted jointly by Kennedy and a centrist Democrat, was introduced to increase transparency in political communications. It wasn't sweeping legislation. It wouldn't lead headlines. But it was tangible. It was a start. Because for Kennedy, that's what the hearing had been all along. Not a performance, but a reminder. That truth, no matter how inconvenient, could still cut through. And as he returned to work, his steps were not of a man vindicated, but of one reinvigorated. He had faced the edge of public doubt, waited in silence, and let integrity do what speeches could not. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more true political moments that reveal the minds and maneuvers behind the headlines. And if you want to see another powerful example of strategy meeting principle, click the video suggested right here on your screen, because the story never ends, it only continues.